militarized one. Okay, so next slide, please. I'd like to talk about the overall policy environment in which we created the study. No? We all know that there's a lot of policy instruments available at the global and Philippine level that have to do with children and children's rights. However, there are no dedicated programs for orphans in the Philippines, much less orphans of war. We found out, though, that the only exception to this rule has to do with the orphans of soldiers and military personnel who have been killed in action or wounded in action. But obviously, there are no legislations or policies for orphans of Mujahideen combatants of the MILF or MNLF. Nevertheless, if you look at the language of the 2014 peace agreement between the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the Philippine government, there are very clear provisions guaranteeing support for children of widows, PWDs, and other vulnerable groups. And if you look at the next slide, we look at how this is also tied to commitments for the demobilization of combatants and being able to provide a justice process and confidence building measures, even as the transition of the Philippine government and the MILF is ongoing. No? And we're very happy that even early on, the Bangsamoro Authority in the body of Mr. Jajurie has provided very clear commitments that the Bangsamoro government will be able to address this key commitment. So moving forward, I'll speak about the methods involved, given the rather interesting limitations we had on the ground. Although the origins of the study are rooted in 2017, we were only able to do field research from April to September 2019. Just 4 months of in-depth research before moving on to iterations of validation and consultations with key stakeholders. All in all, we were able to speak to 273 respondents across 34 municipalities and 7 provinces, with the majority of the respondents being women, no? And that speaks to the rather gendered dimension of the issue. Again, given limitations, we're not speaking of statistical representation. However, the mixed methods we employed hopefully provide a baseline which can be extended by the key stakeholders, including the Bangsamoro government. And we're very happy to hear that they're now starting to build a full database, which will be able to pinpoint where these kids are, including the different institutions available on the ground, providing support to them. So moving on, I'll speak a bit about how we were able to find our respondents. No? And given, again, the limitations of data and statistics available for the BARMM, conflict area issues as usual, what we did was to map out the major conflict events in the last 10 years, starting from 2008, which is the major conflagration in central Mindanao, until the present day. And by mapping out the key events from year to year, we were able to identify particular municipalities where you have very dense agglomerations of children who are affected by these conflicts. No? As a result, we were able to speak to quite a few kids and their families, and provided a very clear range of situations where you would need to provide support, and that would cover everything from events in central Mindanao to the Marawi siege to more recent events in the islands, including events involving Abu Sayyaf and other ISIS-inspired groups. We also relied heavily on case studies and narratives moving forward. So the next slide will show you the 10 in-depth case studies that were done looking at different facets of the issue. And that looked at, for example, how you have issues in Marawi where we have children whose parents' bodies were never found, involving both combatants and civilians who were displaced and are still displaced to this day. From the issues, we also looked at best practices, including a Turkish-run facility in Cotabato that is actually created as a result of the peace agreement, including what the MILF internally has been able to do with their own orphans in the last few decades. This is the MILF's social welfare arm. And so we're looking forward to seeing how the best practices available will be applied by the Bangsamoro government. We also looked at how the Catholic Church and even the Philippine government was able to provide support to their own. So we did not just look at how combatants were supported, but also, for example, how the Philippine government has been able to support or not support the Philippines' own social, own AFP, NPNP, police and military combatants as well. Towards the end, we also looked at more glaring policy issues, particularly for cases where you involve black flag actors, including, for example, the Orphans of the Abu Sayyaf group, where we see that we have intergenerational processes. We have one person who are former Moro National Liberation Front who joins the Abu Sayyaf, and you have young people who start out doing basic robbery and such, but becoming Abu Sayyaf members. And lastly, even looking at how these different effects change for men and women, depending on age, and even for rank and file and the leadership of major revolutionary groups. So from that more qualitative process, we now looked at more quantitative information. Next slide, please. Wanting to understand the fundamental question, just how many orphans are there, no? And so we tried to look at available data, most of which is held by the armed groups, well, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front itself, no? Its Social Welfare Committee reportedly has a list of 8,000 plus orphans as of 2019, whereas the BWAB, which is the armed wing, the women of the armed wing of the MILF, also has another working list of around 500 widows and 500 orphans. And so this is tied to the process also of working out data for demobilization of the competent communities, and points to the need for a more rigorous process of information gathering and validation. Next slide, please. Looking at both supply and demand entails also looking at the kinds of institutions on the ground that actually provide support. And these images that you're seeing are photos from so-called markaz or centers, informal private-owned madrasas on the ground, which become de facto orphanages. And we found that the majority of the institutions providing support to orphans are of this nature, very private, very informal, and therefore the kinds of resources available are spotty at best. Many of them depend on zakat or tithes and donations, both from community members here in the Philippines and also from Islamic communities abroad. And so you have children surviving on 500 pesos a month, which would cover basically everything from education, food, clothing, sanitation. And if the markas runs out of resources midstream, then the kids will have to leave. And that creates a kind of environment where, which is very uncertain and creates double layers of displacement for these children. Next slide, please. A major part of our work was trying to understand not only the situation of these orphans and institutions, but also how communities themselves understood the situation of orphans and children in these situations. And so a lot of it also was trying to understand typology of orphans and widows, no? And so we found out that many of the orphans lost the father, and so we create a situation where we also need to find out how to provide support to widows and their immediate families who are involved, no? We also tried to look at the types of dwellings, no? And we found that as with a majority of displacement situations in the Philippines, many of these orphans are home-based, meaning they're living with family or extended families or clans. So very few of our respondents are actually living in center-based institutions, no? And those who are in these institutions are living in de facto orphanages, madrasas, markads, or what they call turil, which is a homegrown kind of orphanage, homegrown kind of center, which becomes de facto orphanages. And so we also looked at the range of experiences, ranging from those whose parents were mujahideen who died in combat against government, as well as mujahideen who died as a result of other more horizontal conflicts, as well as civilians who died in the crossfire. A more gray area would be parents who died in displacement, but also disappeared or remained missing, as well as those who were interred in unmarked graves. So next slide, please. So from the supply perspective, we also try to look at the situation of those who are caring for the orphans. No? As we said, the first line of support always comes from the family. First line would be the mothers or the widows if they survive, and if not, they're usually passed on to other relatives. And next line of support will be from the community, no? And many of them rely on zakat or sadaqah from politicians, local leaders, the religious institutions, or their neighbors, no? And in very few cases do we have other more formal support institutions which would provide either in-house center support, very rarely, or service providers like NGOs and other institutions providing other kinds of access. The next slide will show you the range of support provided to orphans, no? Where the blue will show what kind comes from the family, the paler orange one would be community support, and then the gray would be what kinds of support are provided by centers. No? And we find that across the board, it's mostly from the family, the only exception being livelihood, which comes from the community. And that comes in the form of ad hoc jobs, mostly unpleasant things which other people would not want to do, unfortunately. And so that creates this interesting situation where although culturally orphans are loved and respected, and that it leads to the kinds of hadiths which enjoin their support for orphans, nevertheless, you still do have situations of maltreatment and abuse. And the next slide now will also show information on duration of support. And again, we find that regardless of type, most of the support tapers after the first or second years after the death of the father. Afterwards, more or less, the kids are on their own. Next slide will also speak about the kinds of community support available. No? And it's Eid tomorrow. We found that a lot of these kinds of community support are usually centered around these special events. No? During the Ramadan season, you do have a lot of donations, food, clothing, sometimes scholarships done by more affluent members of the family. We only have one particular case of kafala or yung stewardship arrangements, but more or less this is unheard of in the region, largely because it's there's still that strong community and family focus for the most part. The next slide will also show the kinds of centers that are providing support, and this also speaks about the kinds of data gaps available as far as understanding institutions on the ground in the Bangsamoro. Around the same time as the study was being done, another NGO did a kind of mapping of the madrasas available in the region. And so this is something that will need to be looked at more closely, given that these are institutions that are outside the purview of government control or supervision. And one major finding we found is that number one, next slide please, you have the prevalence of these kinds of institutions. These are images from what they call turil or homegrown madrasas or centers, mostly in the Marawi city area, and they're everywhere. Nevertheless, you have no, there's no standardization of what kinds of curriculum is being covered by these groups, or much less the resources available or the quality of education provided to these children. Although I understand after the state, yes?
Just a 5-minute time warning.
Oh, okay. The next slide will also, well, this long list of areas, please, next slide, please. Well, the next image will also look at, this is the only NGO available on the ground that actually provides specialized support to orphans. It's called Save the Children of War in Basilan. Unfortunately, they're the only ones who do this, have a clear mandate for orphans, because all other NGOs do have support for children, but it's not focusing on orphans of war. The next slide also speaks a bit about what government programs are available for the orphans, no? And we find that, again, there's no government program at the national level which speaks about this, with the exception being what's provided to the military or police personnel who die in action. Although there's now a growing interest in more PCVE responses, looking at orphans for former child soldiers. However, this is not this is something that is in its infancy. It's not yet wide scale. So the last part of the presentation looks at the needs of the orphans and how to possibly address them. And we find that there are 5 major requirements that children would need, no? And it's not just about education or livelihood, which is something that is often the baseline, no? But major findings also look at emotional and spiritual support, and most especially being able to provide safety and security for displaced communities, which is something that, especially for our respondents in Central Mindanao and the island provinces, many of them are still IDPs, no? And therefore are still in situations of displacement. And lastly, access to justice, which is very much tied to the vulnerabilities to recruitment, among other things. So the next slide will speak about the effects of being orphaned, and that speaks about the level of unsafety, the lack of safety that is experienced by these children, which have obvious effects on household income and other economic effects, especially on women and girls. The next slide will speak about how this affects the mother in particular. And we find that many of our respondents, whether male or female, tend to marry young. And we have one respondent who's already a widow herself. Now, the next slide will also speak about, again, the kinds of access to emotional and spiritual needs, among others. And for the most part, although the more fundamental things are provided, others are not. And we see it more so now with the pandemic. I'll speak a bit about the next slide about the issues around access to justice. And although we find that the majority of the respondents said that they didn't need or feel the need to get revenge, no? In the sense that many of them had found the death of the father as something inspirational. In the sense it's something that they did not want to besmirch their father's memory. Nevertheless, around 16% of our respondents spoke that they did seek revenge or vengeance or justice. And some of them admitted to that being a trigger for joining armed groups. No, for those who, another small percentage said that even if they didn't need to join the armed groups, their sibling was already a member and therefore was responsible for that kind of responsibility for the clan. And so in terms of recruitment for Black flag groups, across the board, we find that the kinds of motivations that drive people to join the more formal revolutionary groups versus the motivations for joining the more Black flag inspired groups are more or less the same. And we find that being unattended, ignored, unloved, or not having exposure to other non-violent ways of life, these are all conditions which create vulnerability, you know? And therefore there's a fundamental need to provide opportunities for these children, full stop. The last slide will speak about the kinds of recommendations, and therefore they're fundamental, no? Policy measures, including legislative measures at the national and regional level, and we're glad that the Bangsamoro government is now working on this, including the need to establish baseline data on orphans and widows, including the de facto orphanages providing support on the ground. And lastly, more or less, as you provide these kinds of packages, being able to ensure that all of these are done in a consultative manner. The next slide speaks about the key principles of design, particularly for targeting. And we highlight that although there is a kind of geographic tailoring that is necessary, we hope that the kinds of support provided will be status neutral, meaning it will be provided to parents to children regardless of the parents' status or rank. And that's particularly an issue for kids of Black Flag members who are being driven away by their community members. And so if these children are not given opportunities, then where do they go? We also speak about tailoring, safeguards, and most importantly, being able to do a more family-focused and community-focused support. In contrast to more Western models of engagement with orphans, the Bangsamoro experience really speaks about the community and family focus. And lastly, we speak about possible innovations, next slide, on how the Bangsamoro government and other actors can provide more stable financing to ensure that these needs are met, whether it's earmarking of funds of national and local governments, using Islamic financing for this, and partnering with the private sector. The next slide now summarizes the range of interventions. And if you look at the report, this spells out the different recommendations at multiple levels. All right, so that's more or less where we're at. And we hope that this kind of discourse can be taken up by more players, because this is something that has been an issue for the last 30 years, and we hope that 10 years hence we will no longer need to support these children. So thank you very much for your time, and good morning.
Thanks, Ica, for the whirlwind summary. Really useful. We have a couple of questions in the text, and also people who had raised their hands. We might go first to Albert Santoli for a question. Albert was the first one to raise his hand. What was it you wanted to ask, Albert?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Oh, that's great. Salaam alaikum and Eid Mubarak to all of our Muslim brothers and sisters. A main concern that I have working in BARMM area is what's going to happen this coming new year. Not new year, but new school year, where it seems no one is quite prepared for the next 6 months of how to keep children learning in school and away from elements that might take them to the wrong side. In the Lanao, Mindanao area, how are you trying to address that, both in terms of orphans, but also just ordinary kids? Because a lot of their families can't afford either to have the learning technologies at home or to send them to school.
Great question. This is a live discussion and debate for within the BARMM executive and the cabinet at the moment. I might go first to Minister Jajurie if you're still there, Minister.
Yes, I am, but unfortunately, I am not. I don't have the latest information regarding the specific plans. I do know that there's this discourse, especially after the SONA of the president, where there seems to be a direction towards not having physical face-to-face interaction in schools. But where the Ministry of Basic Higher and Technical Education will bring the method or the mode of teaching, I think is still being worked at. We do know that there are problems regarding internet connection, and therefore online learning may not be successful at this point. That's what I know at the moment.
Yeah. In terms of the access of orphans to education, what's the interface between the Ministry of Social Services and Development and the Ministry of Basic Higher and Technical Education for those children? How do you address, when those needs are identified, how do you go about addressing it, or is it left to the local governments?
The way we see it, it has to be done together with the Ministry of Basic Higher and Technical Education. just like some programs like For Peace, we do have to connect with them as education is part of the conditionalities. That's the same way we envision a program for supporting the education of orphans. We need to work with the other ministries and ensure that if ever we provide, for example, financial assistance, that this assistance actually go to education. But we haven't started the program. We are doing the database and designing the different facets of the program. And we're going to connect with the other ministries for this.
Right. Thank you for that. There was another question from Elizabeth Silva on which Ica is beginning to respond to in the chat, which is basically that there seems to be a 2-to-1 ratio between girl orphans and boy orphans. Elizabeth was asking why that may be and what are some of the different issues that boys and girls face on gender norms, both in terms of accessing the kind of services and support that the study looked into, but I guess also more in terms of community support and engagement. Ica?
Okay, so thanks. I was responding via the chat box, but just to clarify, the first thing is that we're limited by the methods, no? And so we spoke first to those who were willing to speak, and second, the respondents were mostly 18 and above. So we spoke to older orphans, their mothers, and those who took care of them. Because the predominant perception on the ground is that it's a women's concern, so to speak, no? And so even within the MILF, the body responsible for orphans would be the Women's Auxiliary and the Social Welfare Committee headed by women. Nevertheless, if you take a look at the existing databases held by the MILF and even the MNLF, it's more or less distributed equally between the genders, both boy orphans and women orphans. So just to clarify that. And yes, definitely there are differences into how it affects boys and girls, no? For example, one case studies looked at one family, 4 orphans. The elder 2 were girls, the younger 2 were boys, and they coped with the issues of losing their parent differently. So yes, hope that answers your question.
And Hadzer, you're still on the line. The perspective from your research in Basilan, Sulu, and Tawi-Tawi on those issues?
Yep, maybe just a rejoinder with Ica. In particular, in most of the areas that we talk with, particularly in Basilan and Sulu, in terms of needs and gaps, it's more of the same, except that in the context of most of the Moro or Muslim-dominated communities, where male are most likely be the next breadwinner of the family after the father, then most of the male orphans at the earlier age force themselves to look for a work either in Sabah, Malaysia, or in other region, or even out of the country. So from other girls orphans that we talk with, they always express the needs in terms of love and caring differs from the needs of the male orphans and the girls orphans. And I think that's a rejoinder to Ica's response in terms of the gaps in terms of needs, both boys and girls.
Thanks, Hadzer. Minister Jajurie, before we move on to the next question, any perspectives on that issue of gender?
I'm not part of the research team, but I would agree with Ica that there's this notion that taking care of children, including orphans, is women's work, and therefore it's always relegated to that part of the organization or that part of the community headed by women. So that may explain why issues of orphans are considered to be concern of women. And that holds true not only for the Bangsamoro region, but I think it's prevalent in the whole country. It's also part of that culture.
Right. Thank you. Albert, I think you had a follow-up question on transparency.
Yes, thank you. On the transparency, it seems that there often can be enough funds for at least a substantial number of schools and institutions if there is proper transparency and accountability by local leaders at all levels of district, division, when we're talking education, and then when we're looking at the Health and Human Services and even Department of Agriculture for the Gulayan program, one of the key things is nutrition. And I agree with the previous speaker, I think, Ma'am Jajurie, that the expression of love is important. And when the children all eat together as a family, we try to have it such that there's not discrimination, no matter who the parents are, if there are parents. And then the school heads kind of act as the coordinator to make sure that there is a family environment in the school. And that helps to cut down on the issues that cause conflict. I'm sure this is not the case everywhere, especially where there's long-standing issues and family and clan issues as well. But what we try to do is get the parents involved, the men to do whatever kinds of construction or carpentry is needed, and or even building kitchens. And for the women, we ask the mothers to come in shifts, the PTCA, to have people cook every day so that it seems that there is a extension of the home in the school as a way to integrate the orphans and those, there are so many single parent families, to try to bring together these elements to be able to reduce hostilities. Is there any plans like that in right now in the Bangsamoro to extend these kinds of one school, one family, or school family on a district level programs?
Maybe first, Ica, in terms of what you found in the profile of the institutions that were identified, a very limited number, and then the interface between those institutions and the local school structures and local school boards and so on. And then we might segue to Minister Jajurie. You're on mute, Ica, sorry.
There we go.
There you
So definitely, a major finding, as I said earlier, was that most of the institutions on the ground providing support to these children and their families are informal. No? They're privately owned, informal, financed by zakat and other goodwill forms of resources. Therefore, it's integrated with the community in many respects. Like they're owned by upstanding or more influential or members of the community for the most part, but they're not integrated with the school board because again, these are madaris, these are hybrid Islamic centers, no? And therefore, it's still a major issue for the most part. Although the Philippine Department of Education does have a particular ministry handling madaris education, and now the Bangsamoro government also has that kind of interface, that the links aren't there yet. So therefore, definitely, it's still an area of work that will be which will need to be done. But nevertheless, people, given the nature of conflict in the area, I also understand why it's kept in a more informal manner to protect and insulate these centers from what's perceived as interference from the state. So, but I think Minister Jajurie can speak more about it, and Hadzer as well, because I believe his family also now runs a markaz for orphans.
Minister Raissa?
Yeah, well, it's really the domain of the Ministry of Basic Higher and Technical Education, which takes care also of madaris. It's still a work in progress regarding the integrated education, which would combine this culture-based Islamic education with the the more formal education. But in the case of the Ministry of Social Services, I think with respect to orphans, what we want to see would be, you know, modalities of taking care of orphans, not in an institutionalized center-based setting, but ensuring that extended families are able to provide the necessary love and care to these orphans, and when needed, even the community. And therefore, we're looking at how we can study fosterage, ensuring that foster families are able to take in children and not really focus on the more institutionalized center-based settings.
Thank you. And Hadzer, we have a
Yes,
couple of minutes
Sam.
left. Yep.
Yep. I agree with the observation of Ica. Most of the madrasas actually in these communities where most of the orphans are situated are those traditional one, the one that only built besides the mosque and runs by the community and largely dependent on the donations and sponsorship of those individuals within the community. Case in point, most of our orphans that we engage in Basilan, they wanted to pursue further educations, but unfortunately, the higher the grades they goes up, the farthest the distance the schools from the community. So that's some things that disrupts their ability, one, in terms of resources, and of course, second, in terms of the access going to the schools. And madrasa as an alternative, available alternative mode of educations in the community. That's why most of the orphans actually grab the opportunity to just continue their education. So as what we observe in most of the areas, particularly in Basilan, uh, almost all of the orphans that we're engaged with are studying at the madrasa, and most of them have these dreams and ambitions of becoming an alim rather than a teacher, because that's the only viable, for now at least, that's the only viable alternative for them to pursue their dreams and their father's dream for them to be educated. So of course we subscribe to the intentions and the plans of the Bangsamoro government to integrate this hybrid balanced educations in the future.
Thanks, Hadzer. Okay, I think that brings us to a conclusion. Giselle put into the chat the link for the full report, or you can just Google Age Foundation Children of War. I would like to wrap up by saying thanks to everyone who's dialed in and joined in for this virtual presentation. Thank you to Minister Jajurie for making time and spending time with us this evening, and for the dedication and work that you and your team are showing on these issues and have shown for the time since you took office. We really appreciate the cooperation and collaboration. Thanks to Ica and Hadzer representing the rest of the research team, and to Narada and Giselle from the TAF office. And that's it. Any further questions that you have, we're happy to respond directly. There are email addresses on the screen, and we can also put you in touch if you'd like to directly with some of the research team. Thanks everyone for participating, and good night.
Good night, Sam. Good night, everyone. Eid Mubarak to all. Boss
Eid
Ica.
Mubarak, Hadz.
Eid Mubarak.